If I showed you this and asked you, what is this and what does it let you do, what would you say? If you said, this is a checkbox and lets you select multiple options, you would be absolutely correct. Sometimes you fill it in with a tick, sometimes a cross. Either way, this is a checkbox. Now, if instead I showed you this and asked you the exact same questions, what would you say this time? If you said, this is a radio button and lets you select a single option, you would also be absolutely correct. Now, what if I showed you this? You're probably going to say, well, that's a checkbox again. No, that is a radio button made by a web developer. This is exactly what happens when people think they know better than established standards. The standards start to erode away. And recently I came across this blog post in loving memory of the square checkbox, which along with having a yellow background, which I very much appreciate when looking at the rest of the web, it also has possibly the weirdest dark mode I've ever seen. It's a flashlight. Now, I'm not going to use it like this, but I do think that's neat. For now though, let's focus on the content. This usage of checkboxes and radio buttons is not new in the digital landscape. This is a checkbox. It's a square that has a check mark inside, and its distinguishing feature is that you can select any number of them at the same time. For example, like this. Now, different operating systems have rendered them differently during their evolution. For example, here are some macOS ones going all the way back before Mac OS X, and then I guess after OS X as well, because they rebranded at some point. Here is the Windows side with Windows 11, going all the way back, being shown here in 3.11. It actually goes back a bit further than that, but those are the examples that are here. As you can see, even the check mark wasn't always there. Sometimes, as you can see, it was a cross instead. But the one thing that remained consistent is the checkboxes were square. Sometimes they were rounded squares, but they were always going to be a square. And that's because we also have radio buttons. Their distinguishing feature is a single choice. If you select one, everything else is deselected. Once again, these go back for a really long time. Here is Windows Workgroups 3.11 in 1993, here's Windows 95, and here is Windows 11. And the same is true over on the macOS side as well. Now, there have been weird cases from Apple where they've used rounded squares to indicate a radio button. But in those cases, they were using squares, not rounded squares, for the checkboxes. Also, the way that you actually fill in the button is very different from a checkbox. For a radio button, it uses this filled-in circle to indicate that it's pressed in. The blog author does criticize this, but I see this as more of a technological limitation with drawing circles with this many pixels than an actual issue. It still gets the main point across. Now, this way of showing radio buttons and checkboxes is not a GUI phenomena. This also happens in the TUI space as well. For the radio button, we have these parentheses to indicate a circle sort of shape, and then a dot to indicate the selected element. For the checkboxes, brackets, and then an X in the center. This was in 1992. Here is another application from 1993 doing the exact same thing. This time using lowercase x's, but still doing the same thing. With the author saying, I'm not sure when the distinction between square/round was introduced, but it seems to already exist in the 90s. Now, it's not clear specifically for that, but when it comes to the concept of checkboxes and radio buttons, these did exist prior to existing digitally. If you've ever filled out any paperwork that gets you to select multiple options, you've done a test, or you did a voting form, something like that, you've almost certainly run across a checkbox. Now, the way they're used on paper is often very, very different to how they're used digitally. Sometimes you need to fill it in with a circle. Sometimes you need to use a cross or a tick, or sometimes they're not squares and instead they are circles, and it's just a giant mess. The way we use them digitally is a lot more consistent. Now, as for radio buttons, these are named after physical buttons on a radio. Now, I know most of my audience is older than me, but there are some people that are a bit younger. So if you've never interacted with a radio before, you would often have preset stations, and you would click the button and it would automatically go to that station. Now, you can only have one station activated at a time, so when you press that button, that is your single selection. This was digitized in a lot more straightforward of a fashion, but on radios, oftentimes they wouldn't be circles, so even that part wasn't done exactly the same. Now, the point of all this is every major OS vendor has been adhering to the convention that checkboxes are square and radio buttons are round. Then the web came. And when I say web, I mean CSS. And when I say CSS, I mean Flash and then JavaScript. You see, people on the web think conventions are boring. The regular controls need to be reinvented and redesigned. They don't believe there are any norms. Now, that might be taking it a bit too far, but you'll see why he has this conclusion. That's why it's common to see radio buttons containing check marks. These are not filled in circles, these are ticks. Or square radio buttons. This is the example I showed at the beginning of the video. These are not checkboxes. They look exactly like a checkbox. Following the web's example, native apps introduced us to round checkboxes, also known as circles. Sometimes people just don't make distinctions anymore. For example, here the first group is a single choice, while the second one is multiple choice. So now we don't have any distinction whatsoever. It's just using the exact same method for everything. You know, consistency is nice, but not when it leads to confusion like this. Do you like everything looking like a checkbox? Well, let's have everything look like a radio button. What's the radio button? What's the checkbox? I don't know. Neither does Telegram. But despite all this chaos and temptation, operating system vendors knew better. To this day, they follow the convention. Checkboxes are square, radio buttons are round. Maybe it was part of their internal training. Maybe they had experienced art directors. Maybe it was just luck. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. But somehow they managed to stick to the convention. Until this day. Apple is the first major operating system vendor who would abandon a 4 decades long tradition. Their new Vision OS, for the first time in the long history of Apple, will have round checkboxes. Now, it's actually not as recent as the author might think here. Apple's been abandoning this for quite a while. Whilst a lot of the erosion has come from the web, it's not like the designers on the web only do things on the web. They feed off the people doing native apps, the native apps feed off the web, and every so often, things trickle somewhere else. Here we have an example of iOS. This is a really, really old version of iOS. Look what it's using. Round checkboxes. And here as well, round checkboxes. People have been noticing this trend for a long, long time. This is a post from 12 years ago. Someone noticed this website called dribble.com using round checkboxes. This has been a problem on the web for a long time, and this has been a problem that people knew about over on iOS. The problem is it hadn't made its way into the desktop application side yet, at least from the operating system vendors. That's starting to change. Vision OS is this weird new developing middle ground. It's this VR, AR thing. It takes a lot of inspiration from what's being done over on the iOS side, so it does not surprise me at all. It is using iOS designs. But I would not be surprised if, given a little bit more time, we start to see the trend go further and further and further and completely erode the concept of checkboxes and radio buttons. Anyway, with Apple's betrayal, I think it's fair to say there's no hope for this tradition to continue. A lot of people just copy what Apple is doing. If Apple thinks it's good, it's obviously a good thing. I therefore officially announce 2024 to be the year when the square checkbox has finally died. And I like they used the picture of the Windows XP hill. So what do you think? Do you think it actually matters? Do you think regular people actually notice a difference between a checkbox and a radio button based on the shape it is and how you interact with it? I would like to know. I've not done this research myself, and I don't think I could on my audience anyway, because most of you are fairly technically literate, and you're going to have a very different opinion than the general public. But I would like to know what you think. Let me know down below. And if you like the video, go like the video. And if you really like the video, yeah, and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe to the Brodie linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and click that subscribe button. Something like this.